Thou shalt not kill.
Dive in here with Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. Thou shalt not kill. And as we begin this evening, I want to just characterize the Ten Commandments as honoring various things. For example, the first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me. That's honoring God's supremacy. Number 2, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. That's honoring God's nature. And to seek to represent God in a physical fashion is dishonoring his nature. You cannot, nothing is capable of adequately representing God. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God, commandment number 3. That's honoring God's name. Number 4, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. That's honoring God's day. Now bear in mind that the Sabbath, we've already dealt with this in detail. We're not bound by the Sabbath. In fact, the Christian day is now the first day of the week, which is a Sunday, and that is under attack and assailed as never before in this generation. But the principle is there. The Sabbath command is not repeated in the New Testament. All the others are, and for a good reason. Honor thy father and thy mother. That's honoring parents. Number 6, thou shalt not kill. That's honoring life. Honoring life. Okay, so we're going to get into this in detail here. Now, right here in our area, you know, as we travel around and as we've been here, many of us for quite a few years, we are aware of locations where murders have occurred. There are locations where I've driven by in the past and there's been blue lights and cordoned off area, and we learn short time later there was a murder occurred in that location. In fact, all over the area here. Now, I remember when I was growing up in Ireland many years ago, it was a rare occurrence to have a murder. It was very, very unusual. Now it's commonplace, and in fact, the country has been shocked by several killings recently, including multiple killings over property, land, and in some occasions, very, very trivial matters indeed. But I'm not saying it's worth killing over land either, but scarcely a week goes by without some violent death or other. And of course, on the world stage, I think most people are completely unaware, but of course there is a visible increase in international tension. And in my humble opinion, should the Lord tarry, I believe that there will be another major war before too very long. But aside from that, communism, which is derived from Marxism, has, at a conservative estimate, killed 100 million people. China is very much in the news, and in China, countless millions have been killed in what they call the Cultural Revolution. Horrendous violence. Marxism is a nasty, nasty philosophy, political philosophy that has resulted in countless deaths. And Marxism is on the march today, by the way. Just a few years ago, Wendy and I visited Burma, ministered there, and it's now racked in violence and oppression. Mostly we can put down to communist China's influence, who is the next door neighbor. And we have noticed that the rioters, or whatever, the protesters, have burned a number of Chinese factories. They know where it's coming from. They know what the instigation behind this. So besides that, we could go on. There's all kinds of belief systems that have killed countless millions. Well, where did all this start? Well, we have to go back to the Bible. We go back to the book of Genesis. Everything finds its origin in the book of Genesis. And every major doctrine, we find the source there. We trace this murderous spirit back to the beginning of creation, very, very near the beginning at least. The very first child born into the world was a boy called Cain. Now, we all like babies. I hope. Babies are cute. Once they get over the initial shock of birth and they start to flesh out a bit, babies are really cute. They're lovely. But what a tragedy. The very first baby born into the world turned out to be a murderer. What an utter tragedy. When he grew to be a man, perhaps a very young man indeed, maybe late teens, mid-teens even, early 20s, whatever, he killed his brother Abel. I want you to turn to the book of Genesis. Let's have a quick look at this. There is a statement here in chapter 3, verse 15, from God to Satan, disguised as a snake and the form of a snake, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. Now, of course, that is a prophecy known as the Protevangelicum, the first mention of the gospel, but we also note there that there is a hostility between Satan and mankind. Satan hates mankind. Now, as a little cross reference, let's go to, we are going to go back to Genesis, so make a mark or whatever there, but go to John chapter 8, John's Gospel chapter 8. And in this passage here, there's a fairly robust discussion between the Savior and some Pharisaic nitpicking Jews. You can read it for yourself, the whole thing, but I want to come in at verse 44. Ye are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father ye will do. Now notice it says here, these people had a father, the devil. Now they had earthly fathers, just like Adam and Eve had Cain had an earthly father, Adam, and an earthly mother, Eve. Okay, he was the physical seed of Adam and Eve, but he was the spiritual seed of Satan. Something happened when Adam and Eve rebelled, disobeyed God, as God had warned them. Something very profound happened to the whole human race. Sin entered into the world. We're told there in the book of Romans, by one man sin entered into the world. So, looking at this passage in John 8, this verse, continuing, he was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. So we learn two things about our spiritual enemy here. And by the way, he is our spiritual enemy. He is your spiritual enemy. Now, I don't believe that we are worthy as small fry of his personal attention, but he's got his agents on us. He's got lower grade angels keeping an eye on us and opposing us. We are in a spiritual battle. That's why prayer is so important. We don't know why, except we must trust. We believe the Word of God tells us so. Prayer is so important. It's how God works. It's how the spiritual realm works. That's it. So we're told here in 1 John, it says, not as Cain, who was of that wicked one and slew his brother. So Cain, though he was the fleshly offspring of Adam and Eve, Cain had a spiritual father also. 1 John chapter 3 verse 12 I referred to. This is the message. I'm going to read 11 as well. This is the message which ye have heard from the beginning, that ye should love one another, not as Cain. Cain did not love his brother, who was also of that wicked one. So Cain was spiritually, his father was the devil. He was in rebellion. Now, we go back to Genesis there, and what's going on in the book of Genesis? Now, we have gone through studies with people, and some people have, in chapter 4 of Genesis, been rather sympathetic to Cain. Poor Cain. After all, couldn't God have accepted his sacrifice? How cruel, how thoughtless, how uncaring this is the implication, of God to not accept the sacrifice of Cain. We'll open up the book of Genesis chapter 4 and let's examine, is that a valid point of view? First of all, in verse 1, Cain, I have gotten a man, and by the way, this could be translated, even the Lord. I have gotten a man, Jehovah. That's Jehovah there. So she actually was looking for the seed promise, the one who would be the Redeemer, who would bruise the head of Satan, and she thought Cain would be the one. How she got it so wrong, how tragically different it turned out. Not only was he not the Redeemer, but he was the carry-on of wickedness. Terrible. So in the process of time, verse 2, and she again bore his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So Abel was a keeper of sheep, animals. And in the process of time it came to pass, when Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord, and Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. To get the fat of an animal, you have to cut it, kill it. So we see deeply ingrained in their hearts, they realized the way of approach to God was through sacrifice. I'm sure that was conveyed to them by their parents, because the way of them getting sorted out was God's provision of a covering of skins to cover their nakedness after their fall. And without going too deeply into this, we see here the picture of the gospel. A blood sacrifice was required, and Abel brought the correct sacrifice. Cain brought the fruit of the ground. Abel was accepted, Cain was not. And from a fleshly point of view, a worldly person would say, well, that's so unfair of God. Should he not have accepted Cain? After all, Cain was doing his level best, etc. No. Verse 7, God reasons with him and seeks to help him. If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted. In other words, Cain, if you will do the right thing, you'll be accepted. God appeals to him, reaches out to him, and however, Cain does not respond. He was very wroth, verse 5, and his countenance fell. You could see it written on his face. Okay? So, a very sad situation indeed happening here. And the Bible tells us in James that the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. We have to be careful. Anger is a very dangerous thing. People do things when they're angry that they wouldn't normally do. They're unbalanced, and it's very dangerous, giving way to wrath. And Cain did. And he dug his heels in and refused to come the right way, despite God's very, very personal dealings with him. And the tragic situation unfolds where he goes on to kill Abel. And why did he kill him? Well, it was all about the issue of salvation, because we see down through history there is a conflict between God's people, those who are born again, who are children of God, and those who are the children of the devil. Now, we were all once children of the devil. If you're saved today, it's only because you were saved out of the kingdom of darkness. The Bible talks in another place about being translated, moved across from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light, into God's kingdom. So, the issue at the heart of everything here was how to be saved. The conflict between the sons of God, or a son of God, and a son of the devil started off this whole murderous thing. So verse 8 of chapter 4 of Genesis, Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. The first baby born into the world turned out to be a killer. What a tragedy of the human race that has carried on right down to this very day. And right now, people in the world, people are being killed in horrendous circumstances. Oh, what a grief it is to the heart of our Creator. What an offense to his heart. Genesis 4:9, the Lord said unto Cain, where is Abel thy brother? Of course, God knew where he was. He's seeking to bring forth a confession. But instead he gets a disrespectful remark. Am I my brother's keeper? And God said, what hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive your brother's blood from thy hand. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield to thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be on the earth. So Abel got saved by approaching God in faith with a blood sacrifice, which is the same way people are saved today, except we don't need the blood sacrifice because we have Calvary. Christ has offered a perfect sacrifice on Calvary. But Cain, like so many others today, wish to approach God by means of their good works, and God will never accept him or anybody else on that basis. Now, Cain, of course, the death penalty has not yet been imposed by God, and we'll come back to it in a moment. But controlling Cain was the spirit of this world, who we know as Satan. He too is a murderer. According to the Savior in John 8:44, we quoted, you are of your father the devil, the lust of your father you will do. He was a murderer from the beginning. Okay? So those with murderous intents are controlled by him. Satan plotted the deaths of every human being on earth. He knew the score. He knew the penalty. He enticed Adam and Eve to sin. And he brought it to pass by persuading Eve to disobey God, eat the forbidden fruit. But Adam was responsible. He was the responsible agent present. Every death is terrible. Every death is tragic. But every death ultimately is a murder from the devil, whether it occurs by sickness or accident. But even worse are those deaths that are occasioned by a deliberate act of violence. So, I want to talk about the death penalty for a moment. If you're still in Genesis chapter 6, it's worth having a look there. And verse 5, this is before the flood. Verse 5, and God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man which I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. Verse 11, and God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. So I read 12:11. The earth also was corrupt before God. The earth was filled with violence, killing, etc. So God in his sovereign power and authority. By the way, there are scoffers who say, well, that's genocide or whatever. God is the sovereign giver of life. He is the sovereign power and authority. He has the right to give, and he has the right to take. And so in his sovereign power and authority, God destroyed mankind, started over with Noah and his family. And upon leaving the ark, God instituted in chapter 9 of Genesis what we know as the death penalty. And the death penalty honors life by putting a price on those who take life. So, Genesis chapter 9, verse 5. And surely your blood of your lives will I require, at the hand of every beast will I require it, at the hand of man, at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. So God, by instituting the death penalty, remember, after the violence that occasioned the flood, God said He commanded, this is before the Mosaic law came into being. God gives a command concerning murder. By man shall his blood be shed. This is giving authority to, of course, governments, etc., to execute murderers. It honors life by stipulating the execution of those who take life. Now, as society moves further and further away from God, it moves further and further away from such policies. And they talk about miscarriages of justice and people being wrongfully executed and so on. Well, in some countries, charging people with crimes is a way of getting rid of your political opponents. Communist countries have done this to great effect. Innocent people, at least innocent of the charges anyway, are killed to get them out of the way and all that kind of thing. But I want to just give you a statistic I just found this afternoon. The average sentence served for murder in the UK, I don't have figures for Ireland, is 16 and a half years. It averages between 11 and 18 years. And what about those who are released? There are so many people who are released having served their time for murder, and what do? They go out and they kill again. Between January 2007, May 2015, 12 people were murdered by people who had previously been convicted of murder, according to government figures. Okay, so God commands that those who take human life unlawfully should be executed. Of course, this was later incorporated into the Mosaic law. Exodus chapter 20, we read verse 13. Also Exodus 21, verse 12. He that smiteth a man so that he die shall surely be put to death. An unpleasant business, no doubt, but a necessary. Now, the death penalty is actually endorsed in the New Testament. I want you to go to Acts chapter 25. We read a rather interesting statement from the Apostle Paul. Acts chapter 25 and verse 11. This is the Apostle Paul before Festus. He's been accused by the Jews and is in a spot of legal difficulty. So in chapter 25 and verse 11, he says the following. First of all, he's going to appeal to Caesar because he's a Roman citizen. Every Roman citizen had the tremendous privilege they couldn't be tortured because torture was a regular way of producing confessions, and he couldn't be executed certainly without going through proper due process. And they all had a right to appeal to Caesar. So verse 11, for if I be an offender and have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. So he's saying, if I've done something that is worthy of the death penalty, I'm not going to refuse. I'm not going to evade it. I refuse not to die if I have done something worthy. But if there be none of those things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. So he had the right to go to Rome and be tried there properly. Now, speaking of Rome, let's look at Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13 is the chapter that tells us the tax collector, the revenue are actually God's servants. We live in a country, we have complaints about, how things are handled, but you know what? It's a lot better than being totally lawless, where 14-year-old boys with AK-47s are the rule of law, and bullets dictate right and wrong, as happens in parts of the world today, right now. So Romans chapter 13, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers of government, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. God has ordained government and powers and magistrates and courts and police and so on, and we need to be careful to respect them. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. So those who resist lawful authority are resisting God's power. And the lawful authority, of course, is only limited where they go against God and where they contradict God, and where to obey them would be to disobey God. So, we go on. Them that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. That's judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. That's what they're supposed to be. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power, the earthly power, authority? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. That's what government should do. They should be a terror to evil and praise those who do good. So decent law-abiding citizens should not have any concern about the police. Now, I've been in parts of the world where the police are corrupt. They stop people and take bribes. I've seen that twice in one trip. Better not mention the country. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. We should be afraid. You're breaking the speed limit, you should be afraid, etc. For he beareth not the sword in vain. This is what I wanted to get to. What's the sword for? The sword is for inflicting punishment, even death. He doesn't bear the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So we see the New Testament certainly supports the death penalty. Now, Secretary General of the United Nations, in a speech in February 2019, classed the death penalty as a cruel and inhuman punishment. There is no place in the 21st century for capital punishment. The Secretary General tells the World Congress against the death penalty, urging universal abolishment of the practice, etc. Right now, the United Nations in New York is currently holding the 65th Annual Commission on the Status of Women. On right now, we're right in the middle of it. It's going to finish on the 26th of March. This commission is failing in its real responsibility to aid women worldwide. I'm quoting from an email. It is focusing on pushing for abortion, promoting the LGBT agenda, advocating for radical feminism in the political space, imposing comprehensive sexual education for children and gender ideology. And particularly, they are pushing for the promotion of abortion in third world countries, Africa, and they are keen on making aid conditional upon them pushing this agenda and pushing the LGBT agenda and the ideology of gender fluidity and all that stuff. At the United Nations in 2019, the Trump administration pushed the idea of no international right to abortion. The Trump administration, I quote, is calling on UN member states to oppose efforts to promote access to abortion internationally, a move immediately criticized by reproductive rights groups seeking greater access to the services globally. And they want more abortion, in other words. Why was there an explosion of hatred against Trump for the last 4 years? From 2016, have you noticed the total difference in the recent few weeks and months? Dealing with Biden, there's no hate campaign against Biden. Why was there a hate campaign against Trump? This issue alone is reason enough. And what about Amnesty International? You've heard of them. They are strongly opposed to the death penalty in all circumstances on the ground that it represents the ultimate cruel, inhuman, and degrading punishment and violates the right to life. But I looked on their webpage yesterday, and they celebrate the repeal of the Eighth Amendment in Ireland, which happened in 2018, and opened the door to abortion on demand. This is absolute hypocrisy, because the taking of the unborn life is cruel. There is no anesthetic. The babe in the womb seeks to get away from the knife or whatever means they are using to kill it. is absolute hypocrisy. The same is true of the United Nations, which pretends to stand up for human rights, and yet their Human Rights Council is full of human rights abusers of the most egregious type. Absolute hypocrisy. So a lady came around to my door, a young lady some while back before the lockdowns, collecting money for Amnesty International. I would not give her a penny. In fact, I challenged her on the abortion issue. It's absolute hypocrisy. Can a Christian put money? If you meet them in Grafton Street, they come and knock on your door looking for money, don't give them a penny. They are promoting the killing of the unborn. Wickedness. European Union. Did you know that the Lisbon Treaty enshrined the banning of capital punishment, so that no member state of the EU can actually obey God in this realm and carry out the death penalty? Thou shalt not kill is being violated in our own country. 20 million has been spent on abortion here since it was legalized. 20 million. In 2019, very easy figure to remember, 6,666 babies butchered. And now they're pushing for assisted suicide. Now, I don't know if I circulated the video Fatal Flaws, which is quite a gripping video. It's about an hour long. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it. I'll put the link in below the video here. But what's happening in many countries now, there was a situation in the Netherlands where a woman agreed to be assisted in dying, and then she changed her mind, and the doctor and the family held her down while the doctor stuck the needle in her and injected her with the poison or whatever it was, the medication to kill her. Wickedness. And if this comes in, and of course the recent attempt to bring it in here in Ireland was shot down, failed, but they'll keep coming back, they'll keep pushing, just like they did with abortion. And yet, on the other hand, we have all this claptrap and hypocrisy about the death penalty. And by the way, murder is cheap. Life is cheap. You might get 11.5 years. You might get less if you have a good sob story. How tragic indeed. The Saviour mourned over death at the funeral, the funeral of Lazarus. Jesus wept, and he called him forth. And God is upset about the violence in the world today, the countless millions of babies that are killed, and of course countless other innocents who have grown up and are murdered too. The world is filled with violence and is crying out for God's judgment and God's intervention, and surely it cannot be too long. Thou shalt not kill. But we need to be careful. As we learned in Matthew's Gospel, we can commit murder in our hearts, and if we're honest, within each one of us, given the right circumstances, yielding to sin and wickedness, we too could kill. What a terrible, terrible thought. That's why we need to walk close with God. We need to be in His Word. We need to be in fellowship with His people. We need to be careful and cry out to God to keep us, help us keep our wrath and anger under control, lest we bring shame on the name of Christ. And instead, let us fill the world with kindness and Christ's love and care for others. We're living in a lost world that is crying out for light, and we have the glorious light of the gospel, and let's share it.